That's 69 nice inputs in 10 seconds. That's 7 out of a possible 15 inputs every single second. If we're already breaking software, hardware, fleshware, the obvious question becomes, what'll it take to hit the other 8? Mashing can refer to a couple of different input methods, but the core concept is generally the same. In a moment of desperation, the developers want the player to feel their avatar's struggle, so instead of a simple input, the player must rapidly repeat a motion, usually in a limited period of time. The most common is a singular repeated button, but you can also wiggle or whisk the stick or sticks, or even montage through a sequence. The point is that it's a desperate, tedious, and often sudden burst of surprisingly demanding activity. The best examples come from Metal Gear Solid, where you get captured and tortured. In order to survive, you need to mash rapidly and for a long period of time. It's often the hardest part of the game, and not infrequently bottlenecks the slower players terminally. In the first game, death meant getting kicked back 30 minutes, and as if that wasn't enough, you could also spill, dooming your lady friend and getting you the bummer ending. The stakes for these sequences get pretty all or nothing, but even if it's mindless exertion, we can always figure out how to get good. But it's bad, though. The first difficulty we're going to run into on this journey is that most of these turbo events are plainly bad game design. In fighting games, it's possible to stun your opponent into a dizzied state. This gives the attacker plenty of time to prep their deadliest option, but devs often let the dizzy player mash to wake up sooner. Because of this, it can be very difficult to tell how long a dizzy will actually last, so players often resort to their usual tactics: a dash attack. The mechanic trivializes itself because people who care will always be able to manhandle something when they want to. I think the real distinction between a good and bad flurry is the conveyance. Video games are black boxes. We just don't get to know what's going on under the hood. And they are never more blacker than boxing with a Skinner box. We need a proper prompt to tell us what is happening, and the prompt needs a bit of warning before the real fun can begin. Otherwise, we'll always start on the back foot. There also needs to be some sort of feedback for what we're actually doing. Are we trying to get to a certain number of inputs, or do we just need to keep up a good rhythm? Some games even read your inputs. Starfox Adventures has Musclefoot, who gets stronger depending on how hard you mash. So the only viable way to beat him is to start slow and only go ham to finish the job. However, there's no indication that he's using your strength against you, so many players end their run once they get to this guy. Even when it's completely straightforward, it's not always clear how hard you gotta go. RE4 was built for 30 FPS but was later bumped to 60. Yet the minecart finale was never rebalanced, so you have to mash twice as hard. However, since it does not appear that Leon was having a particularly rough time holding on, many players die confused. On top of that, not all these struggles appear to have an upper limit. Mario Party often has you racing for the best rate of fire, but when the peak is actually over a dozen inputs per second, there's no reason to shy away. The in-game stakes may be a small percentage chance at a smaller percentage chance of winning, but this is Mario Party. If I'm willing to trade lifetime friendships to get third over fourth, what deterrence is $20 out my wallet and 3 centimeters off my thumb give me the star? We have 2 variables to play with, frequency and length. But even then, Solidus's furious 70-second chokehold feels nowhere near as desperate as the 101's slower 25. The flash is not insignificant. If the goal is instead to physically damage your player, then the real secret is to ask them to thread the needle. If the player can disassociate from exertion, they will, but if they need to stay within a certain window, they will have to feel out every adjustment. It hurts way more when you have to tell your brain to relax by a hair, and it hurts way more when they then have to convince their brain to unrelax. To my knowledge, this is the most damage you can deal to a player before going for the eyes, the ears, or the emotions. If you have any innovative ideas, take measures to ensure that they die with you. It's time to learn you how to press a dang button. I realize that beyond rate and time, there are a considerable number of variables between what controller you're on, the time you've got to position yourself, and what other actions you may need to juggle at the same time. But I'll cover the fundamentals and we can work on application later. Also, remember, these techniques are intended for use on video games and video game accessories. We aren't talking about anything other than video games and video game accessories. Number 1, the Finger Vibrator. The most basic fundamentals of holding a controller and pressing a button involve holding the controller and pressing the button. Stability and input. You're going to want to pin it down and vibrate on it at the maximum perceptible frequency, between the minimum space required to create the binary input and the minimum negative edge. Our optimum speed is typically going to be half of the game's frame rate. Go any faster and we'd be too fast for the computer to see. We can work on the after image technique later, but for now let's aim for 15 hits per second. That way we won't have to hold back to max out Mario Party's 30 FPS. Alright, here's one weird trick to press a button good. Point forward with your right elbow, and then smack the muscle just below it, hard enough to hear an echo. Can't try your best without a stiff triceps. No triceps exceptions accepted. This muscle will keep your arms stiff as you wiggle either your elbow or wrist for pads or keyboards respectively. Then it's just a matter of minimizing your release. For pads, your index finger will lock everything in place, but most other controllers will just have to rely on dexterity. This approach is generally the best, not because of results, but because of practicality. It only needs one hand and you don't have to readjust your grip much. It's great for when panicked moments suddenly begin or end, or when you may need your other hand to multitask. The important thing to remember is to stabilize your tricep, which improves speed, prevents mistakes, and staves off exhaustion. That flex is applied for any rush that has any intention behind it. Number 2, the rub down. If you got time to get into position, then this technique is usually faster. It also helps if you can mash more than one button. Flex the tricep, but this time the elbow vibrates horizontally. Instead of pressing the button down like a normal human being, you press it down from the side and release it in crossing over. That way we get the upsies and the downsies on ones instead of on twos. That's value. That's double value. This one is largely dependent on what shape your controller is and what shape your buttons are. You need enough room to completely cross over, and you don't want to mash your buttons against something that's too tall. Again, this one requires a bit of time to position, but if that's not a concern, then it typically leads to faster results. You want to make sure the part making contact with the controller doesn't have much friction, and ideally you'd want to make sure it won't hurt after. I don't want you getting hurt out there. We've got 8 more frames to hit. The classic example for getting through difficult bottlenecks was to use a spoon, since the rounded bottom will deal with most buttons at a better rate, with less effort, without bitching about it after. This is more likely to go off target because of the parallel movement, which could result in damage to your body, property, or loved ones. But that threat can be minimized if you don't care. Number 3, Double Teamer. This is the fastest I ever really go. By modifying the previous tech with a repeater, we can effectively double our input by changing our positioning. This will add to adjustment time, but it's worth it for big number. If you have a second hand available, you can modify the vibrator with a second finger. You use both for input, but only the first one vibrates. As you bring your hand up, you'll also bring the controller forwards. If you do this with intention, you can both stabilize and input with that second finger by ramming the button into it. The 2-finger vibrator has just as many inputs per motion as the rub down, with the added benefit of less positioning. The only drawback is the second hand, which isn't too bad given that you don't need any other buttons. Since it's not too much effort to accelerate out of a 1-finger vibration into a double, I consider this to be the optimal approach for maxing out speed. However, the double rub gets a minimum of 4 inputs per waggle, so that merits examination, I'd say. It's a simple motion, just do the OG tech with 2 fingers spaced out. This way the button will come up between the inputs, but you get however many fingers used per slide. I prefer 2 fingers because controllers are usually pretty small, but go nuts. You probably won't damage the button because of the angle, but at some point the smaller deliberate movements will outpace the sloppy gunk as you improve. It's a tad unclear if forcing your player to self-harm is obnoxious tedium or the absolute pinnacle of game design. Even with all our new tech, it was never about the strategy. You know how to win, but if you die in real life, you die in the game. That's infinitely scarier. Games got a weird chip on their shoulder since they lack the cultural prestige behind the movie's theater or the sports stadium, despite the medium's sizable advantages both as fiction and as game. But we discovered an oddly thread needle here. If games have entirely divorced themselves from the limitations of our fleshy bods, then empathy is a level cap. But there is value in games that leave you sweaty. I ain't trying to get shot for the culture, but maybe I am.
Kill him! Kill him! Kill him! Got him.
Okay, I'm just not down.
You're doing it for a while. It's a long song.